there is a city beneath the Mediterranean Sea. It does not appear on any modern map. It has no postal code, no government, no living residents. And yet, for centuries, it was one of the wealthiest ports on earth. It welcomed ships from Greece, from Phoenicia, from lands whose names have since been forgotten. Traders exchanged gold and silver on its docks. Temples rose above its streets, carved from limestone and adorned with statues of gods. Priests performed rituals in courtyards that smelled of incense and salt air. Thousands of people lived and worked within its walls. And then, slowly and without mercy, the sea swallowed it whole. The city is called Heracleion. Some ancient texts refer to it as Thonis. For more than 1,000 years, scholars debated whether it had ever truly existed. The references were scattered and contradictory. The Greek historian Herodotus mentioned it in passing. Other writers placed it somewhere along the Egyptian coast, near the mouth of the Nile. But no one could point to it on a map. No ruins stood above the waterline. No stones jutted from the sand. It had vanished so completely that many serious historians dismissed it as legend, the kind of story ancient people told to explain a world they did not fully understand. Then, in the year 2000, a French underwater archaeologist named Franck Goddio made a discovery that silenced every skeptic. Working in Abu Qir Bay, roughly 6.5 kilometers off the Egyptian coast near the modern city of Alexandria, his team found something extraordinary on the seabed: stone walls, columns, statues taller than a grown man. The remains of temples dedicated to Amun, the supreme god of the Egyptian pantheon. Gold coins, bronze vessels, jewelry still crusted with the sediment of centuries. Wooden hulls of ancient ships, preserved in the silt. Anchors, lamps, offering plates. The ruins stretched across an area of roughly 110 square kilometers of seafloor. This was not a single building or a shipwreck. This was an entire city, intact enough to map, sprawling enough to stagger the imagination. Heracleion had been sitting beneath roughly 10 meters of water, buried under layers of sand and clay, for more than 1,200 years. The Mediterranean had been keeping this secret since roughly the 8th century of the Common Era. Waves had rolled over it, fishing boats had sailed above it, swimmers had kicked through the water directly overhead, without ever knowing that beneath their feet lay one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the modern age. The city that ancient writers described as a gateway to Egypt, a mandatory stop for any ship entering the Nile Delta, had been hiding in plain sight beneath the surface of a sea that millions of people visit every single year. The question is not simply what happened to Heracleion. The question is how an entire city, a city of stone and bronze and towering granite, can disappear so thoroughly that human civilization forgets it ever existed. The question is what that disappearance tells us about the fragility of everything we build, everything we trust, everything we assume will last. The ocean floor holds answers that the surface world has barely begun to ask. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not only the story of Heracleion, the drowned Egyptian metropolis, but also what its rediscovery reveals about the staggering amount of history that remains hidden beneath the waves. You are going to understand the forces that dragged this city into darkness, the expeditions that pulled its secrets back into the light, and the unsettling truth about how much of our own planet we have never seen. Because the ocean does not give up its dead willingly. It holds them, it buries them, and it waits. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Consider what it means for a city to vanish, not a village, not a handful of huts along a riverbank. A city, a place with temples large enough to hold hundreds of worshippers, a harbour capable of docking dozens of warships simultaneously, streets paved with stone and lined with market stalls, a population that may have rivaled some of the great cities of the ancient Mediterranean. This was not a settlement that faded over centuries because people moved away. This was a catastrophe. The ground beneath Heracleion gave way, the waters rose, the buildings sank, and the sand closed over them like a burial shroud. What makes this story even more haunting is the realization that Heracleion is not unique. It is merely the most dramatic example of a phenomenon that stretches across every ocean and every coastline on Earth. There are cities beneath the Black Sea. There are temples submerged off the coast of India. There are stone structures resting on the seafloor near Japan that no one can fully explain. The surface of our planet is covered in monuments to civilizations that the water has claimed, and we have explored less than 5% of the ocean floor with any real thoroughness. What else is down there, waiting in the silt and the silence and the crushing dark? What other cities have we forgotten? Tonight, we descend, not with scuba tanks and flippers, but with something more powerful, with patience, with evidence, with the weight of what has already been found, and with the unsettling awareness of what has not. We follow the trail left by Frank Godiot and his team. We walk the streets they mapped on the seafloor. We stand in the temples they uncovered, and we confront a truth that is as old as the ocean itself. The water does not care what you build. It does not care how beautiful your statues are, how thick your walls, or how powerful your gods. Given enough time, the water wins. It always wins. Now, let us begin. To understand how a city disappears beneath the sea, you first need to understand the sea itself. Not the postcard version. Not the turquoise shallows where tourists wade with their children. The real sea. The version that covers more than 70% of the surface of this planet. The version that contains, according to current scientific estimates, roughly 1.335 billion cubic kilometers of water. The version that, in its deepest places, descends to nearly 11,000 meters below the surface. A depth so extreme that if you placed Mount Everest at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, its peak would still be submerged by more than 2,000 meters of water. The Mediterranean Sea, where Heracleion rests, is not the deepest ocean on Earth. Its maximum depth is roughly 5,267 meters, found in the Calypso Deep, a narrow trench southwest of Greece. But what the Mediterranean lacks in abyssal extremes, it compensates for in history. This is the sea that cradled the birth of Western civilization. The Phoenicians sailed it, the Greeks charted it, the Romans built an empire around its shores. The Egyptians used it as a highway for trade, funneling goods from the African interior through the Nile Delta and out into the wider world. Every major civilization that has touched its coastline has left something behind in its waters. Shipwrecks number in the tens of thousands. Submerged ruins dot its floor from one end to the other. The Mediterranean is not just a body of water, it is an archive, and Heracleion sat at one of the most strategically important locations in that entire archive. The city was positioned at the western edge of the Nile Delta, near the Canopic branch of the river, which was, in antiquity, the main navigable channel connecting the Mediterranean to the interior of Egypt. Every foreign vessel entering Egypt by sea was required to pass through Heracleion. It was a customs port, a religious checkpoint, a commercial hub. Imagine a funnel through which all the wealth of the ancient Mediterranean had to pass before it could reach the markets and temples of the Egyptian heartland. That funnel was Heracleion. The city sat on a series of islands and peninsulas within a shallow lagoon, threaded through with canals. Think of it as a kind of ancient Venice, except older, warmer, and far more powerful. Its harbour was massive, capable of accommodating the largest trading vessels of the era. Archaeologists have found the remains of more than 60 ancient ships in the waters around the site, some of them remarkably well preserved. They have found anchors by the hundreds. They have found stone blocks so large that moving them must have required coordinated teams of labourers and engineers. The infrastructure was not primitive. It was sophisticated, planned, and built to last. And yet it did not last. To understand why, you need to understand what lies beneath the seafloor of Abu Qir Bay. The geology of the Nile Delta is, to put it plainly, unstable. The delta is not solid rock. It is sediment, the accumulated deposits of millennia of Nile flooding. Layer upon layer of silt, clay and sand, compressed under its own weight but never truly solidified. This kind of ground is vulnerable to a process called soil liquefaction. When saturated sediment is subjected to sudden stress, such as an earthquake or a rapid change in water level, the particles lose contact with each other. The ground behaves, for a brief and catastrophic moment, like a liquid. Anything built on top of it sinks. This is not speculation. Geological surveys of the Abu Qir Bay region have confirmed the presence of fault lines and evidence of seismic activity. Core samples taken from the seabed show layers of disrupted sediments, consistent with sudden subsidence events. The picture that emerges is one of a city built on borrowed time, a city whose magnificent weight was always pressing down on ground that could not, in the end, support it. But geology alone does not explain the full picture. The Mediterranean itself has been rising and falling for thousands of years. Sea levels in the eastern Mediterranean have fluctuated significantly over recorded history. A combination of tectonic subsidence, meaning the ground sinking, and eustatic sea level rise, meaning the ocean itself getting higher, created a slow-motion trap. Heracleion was sinking from below and being swallowed from above simultaneously. The process may have taken decades, it may have taken centuries, but the result was inevitable. Let us talk about pressure for a moment, because pressure is the invisible hand that shapes everything beneath the surface of the sea. At sea level, the atmosphere exerts a pressure of roughly 1 atmosphere, which equals about 1.013 bar. For every 10 meters you descend into the ocean, the pressure increases by approximately 1 additional atmosphere. Heracleion sits beneath roughly 10 meters of water, which means the pressure on its ruins is approximately 2 atmospheres, or about double what you feel standing on dry land. That may not sound dramatic, but consider what that pressure has been doing continuously for more than 1,200 years. It presses on every stone, it infiltrates every crack, it drives salt water into the pores of limestone and granite, slowly dissolving the minerals that hold them together. Pressure is patient. Pressure does not rest. At greater depths, the numbers become staggering. At 100 meters, the pressure is roughly 11 atmospheres. At 1,000 meters, it exceeds 100 atmospheres, enough to crush most human-made structures. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the pressure reaches approximately 1,086 atmospheres, or roughly 1,099 kilograms per square centimeter. A human body at that depth would be compressed to a fraction of its surface volume. The deep ocean is not merely dark, it is violent in its stillness, crushing everything that enters it with a force that the surface world can scarcely imagine. Now, Heracleion does not sit at those extremes. Its ruins are in relatively shallow water, but shallowness brings its own problems. Shallow water is dynamic. Currents move sediment, storms churn the seabed, marine organisms colonize every exposed surface, growing over inscriptions, weakening structural joints, turning carved stone into shapeless mounds. The Mediterranean is not a quiet resting place. It is an active, living system that has been slowly digesting the remains of Heracleion for century after century. To appreciate the scale of what Godio's team found, consider the numbers. The site covers an area of the seafloor equivalent to roughly 110 square kilometers. Within that area, archaeologists have identified the ruins of multiple temples, the largest of which was the Great Temple of Amun. They have recovered a colossal statue of the god Hapi, the deity of the Nile flood, carved from red granite and standing more than 5 meters tall. They have found a pink granite naos, a sacred shrine bearing hieroglyphic inscriptions dating to the reign of Pharaoh Nectanebo I, who ruled in the 4th century before the Common Era. They have found gold coins from the era of Ptolemy II. They have found bronze statuettes of Osiris. They have found stone sarcophagi containing mummified animals, offerings to the gods of the deep. The sheer volume of artifacts is staggering. Hundreds of anchors, dozens of intact ship hulls, thousands of individual objects ranging from jewelry to weapons to ritual vessels. And the excavation is far from complete. After more than 2 decades of systematic work, Godio and his team estimate that they have explored only a fraction of the total site. The city extends further than their surveys have reached. More temples, more harbours, more streets, more secrets lie beneath the silt, waiting for future expeditions to uncover them. The discovery of Heracleion forced historians to rewrite significant portions of what they thought they knew about ancient Egypt's relationship with the Mediterranean world. Before the discovery, the conventional understanding was that Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander the Great in 332 before the Common Era, was the dominant port of the Nile Delta from its inception. Heracleion's ruins prove that this was not the case. For centuries before Alexandria existed, Heracleion served as Egypt's primary gateway to the sea. It was the port that connected the pharaohs to the trading networks of the Mediterranean. It was the place where Greek merchants first made contact with Egyptian civilization on a large scale. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, described a visit to a temple of Heracles at the mouth of the Nile, which many scholars now believe was located in Heracleion. The Greek name Heracleion itself derives from Heracles, the Greek hero, while the Egyptian name Thonis appears in earlier records. The dual naming reflects the city's dual identity. It was a place where Egyptian and Greek cultures met, mingled, and traded. The temples honored both Egyptian and Greek gods. The coins bore both Egyptian and Greek inscriptions. The city was, in essence, a living bridge between two of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. Understanding the light conditions at the site is essential for grasping what archaeological work there actually involves. In the open ocean, sunlight penetrates to a depth of roughly 200 meters in clear conditions, creating what marine scientists call the photic zone, or the epipelagic zone. Below that lies the mesopelagic zone, sometimes called the twilight zone, where light fades to near nothing between 200 and 1,000 meters. Below 1,000 meters is the bathypelagic zone, where no sunlight penetrates at all. Below 4,000 meters is the abyssopelagic zone, and below 6,000 meters is the hadalpelagic zone, named after Hades, the Greek underworld. Heracleion, at roughly 10 meters depth, sits well within the photic zone. Sunlight reaches the ruins. Divers can work without artificial lighting on clear days, but the visibility in Abu Qir Bay is frequently poor. The Nile carries enormous quantities of sediment into the Mediterranean, and that sediment clouds the water. On a bad day, visibility can drop to less than 1 meter. Imagine trying to excavate a 5-meter-tall granite statue when you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. Imagine trying to photograph a hieroglyphic inscription through a curtain of swirling silt. Every artifact recovered from Heracleion was won through patience and persistence against conditions that the ocean made as difficult as possible. The timeline of exploration is worth noting. Gaudio began his surveys of Abu Qir Bay in 1996, working with the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, an organization he had founded. The first major discoveries came in 2000. The colossal statue of Hapi was raised in 2001. The Great Temple of Amun was identified and mapped over subsequent years. Major publications and exhibitions followed, including a traveling exhibition that brought artifacts from Heracleion to museums in London, Paris, and other major cities. Each season of diving revealed new portions of the city, new artifacts, new inscriptions, and new questions. But here is the problem. For every question that Heracleion's ruins have answered, they have raised 3 more. How exactly did the city sink? Was it one catastrophic event, or a series of smaller collapses? When precisely did the final submersion occur? What happened to the population? Did they flee in advance, or were they caught by sudden disaster? The ruins themselves are strangely silent on these points. The stones do not speak. The statues stare upward through the murky water, their expressions fixed in the same serene gaze they have worn for millennia. And the Mediterranean keeps its counsel. What we do know is that something went terribly wrong. A city that stood for centuries, a city of tremendous wealth and strategic importance, a city that every ship entering Egypt had to visit, was abandoned and forgotten so thoroughly that by the medieval period, no one was sure it had ever been real. That kind of erasure does not happen gently. It does not happen slowly enough for people to write about it, to document it, to leave a clear record. It happens in the space between one generation and the next, in that vulnerable gap where living memory fades into legend and legend fades into nothing. To grasp the speed of that erasure, consider a comparison. The city of Pompeii was buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era. Yet Pompeii was never truly forgotten. Roman writers recorded the disaster in detail. The younger Pliny watched it happen and wrote letters about it that survive to this day. The location of the buried city was known throughout the medieval period, even if no one bothered to dig it up until the 18th century. Pompeii had witnesses. Pompeii had chroniclers. Heracleion had neither. Or if it did, Their records perished along with the city itself, consumed by the same waters that consume the temples and the harbours and the streets. There is another comparison worth making, and it concerns depth. The wreck of the Titanic rests at approximately 3,800 meters below the surface of the North Atlantic. At that depth, the pressure is roughly 380 atmospheres. The water temperature hovers near freezing. No sunlight has reached those decks since the ship sank in 1912. The Titanic is effectively entombed in conditions so extreme that even the bacteria consuming its iron hullwork at a fraction of their normal speed. The deep ocean preserves through hostility, making it too cold, too dark, and too crushing for most forms of decay. Heracleion faces the opposite problem. At 10 meters, the water is warm. Sunlight fuels biological growth. Marine organisms thrive. Currents carry abrasive sand across exposed surfaces. The ruins are not preserved by the hostility of the deep. They are slowly eroded by the hospitality of the shallows. Every year, the outlines become a little softer. Every decade, another inscription fades. The clock is ticking on what remains, and it has been ticking for a very long time. Let us talk about the Nile itself, because you cannot understand Heracleion without understanding the river that gave it life, and ultimately contributed to its death. The Nile is the longest river in Africa, stretching roughly 6,650 kilometers from its sources in the highlands of East Africa to its delta on the Mediterranean coast. For thousands of years, the annual flooding of the Nile deposited rich silt across the delta, creating some of the most fertile agricultural land on Earth. This flooding was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. Temples were built to celebrate it. Prayers were offered to ensure it. The god Hapi, whose colossal statue Dio recovered from the ruins of Heracleion, was the personification of that life-giving flood. But the same flooding that nourished the delta also destabilized it. Each year, new layers of wet sediment were deposited on top of older layers. The weight accumulated. The ground compressed unevenly. Water saturated the spaces between particles, creating conditions ripe for liquefaction. The Nile Delta was, and remains, one of the most geologically dynamic coastal environments on Earth. It is constantly shifting, constantly settling, constantly rearranging itself under the combined forces of sedimentation, compaction, and tectonic activity. Modern satellite measurements have confirmed that portions of the Nile Delta are currently subsiding at rates of several millimeters per year. Some areas are sinking faster. The implications for modern Egyptian cities like Alexandria are troubling enough. But for an ancient city like Heracleion, built on reclaimed land at the very edge of the delta, the implications were fatal. The city was built on ground that was literally sinking beneath it, year by year, century by century, until the water finally closed over the highest rooftops. If the ground beneath Heracleion was subsiding at even 2 millimeters per year, a conservative estimate, then over a period of 500 years, the land surface would have dropped by 1 full meter. Over 1,000 years, 2 meters. Combine that subsidence with even modest sea level rise, and the cumulative effect is devastating. A city built at or near sea level does not need a dramatic catastrophe to be swallowed by the ocean. It just needs time. And yet, the archaeological evidence suggests that the final phase of Heracleion's submersion was not entirely gradual. There are signs of sudden collapse. Sections of the city appear to have dropped abruptly, as if the ground gave way all at once. This is consistent with liquefaction triggered by a seismic event. The eastern Mediterranean is seismically active. Earthquakes have struck the Nile Delta region repeatedly throughout recorded history. A single major earthquake, striking ground already weakened by centuries of subsidence and saturation, could have caused large sections of the city to collapse into the waterlogged sediment beneath. Some researchers have proposed that a tsunami may have delivered the final blow. Tsunamis in the Mediterranean are not common, but they are not unheard of either. The coastal geography of Abu Qir Bay, with its shallow waters and gently sloping seafloor, would have amplified the effects of any incoming wave, channeling its energy directly over the low-lying city. The picture, then, is one of compound disaster. Not a single dramatic event, but a convergence of forces operating on different timescales. Slow subsidence over centuries, gradual sea level rise, periodic flooding from the Nile, and then, at some critical moment, an earthquake, a storm surge, or a tsunami that pushed the weakened city past its breaking point. The result was total submersion, total burial, total silence. Consider the emotional weight of that silence. Heracleion was not a quiet backwater. It was loud, it was busy. Ships arrived and departed constantly. Merchants argued over prices. Priests chanted hymns. Metalworkers hammered bronze. Dockworkers shouted instructions in half a dozen languages. The air smelled of fish and spice and burning oil. Children ran through the streets. Music played in the taverns. And then all of it stopped. The sounds were replaced by the soft rush of water. The lights were replaced by the pale, filtered glow of sunlight passing through turbid seawater. The people were replaced by fish. And the silence of the drowned city stretched on for 1,200 years until a French archaeologist and his team broke it with the ping of a sonar array. That sonar array deserves a moment of attention. Modern underwater archaeology relies heavily on technology that did not exist even 50 years ago. Side-scan sonar, which sends acoustic pulses across the seafloor and interprets the returning echoes to create detailed images of submerged structures, was essential to mapping the extent of Heracleion. Sub-bottom profilers, which penetrate the sediment layer to reveal buried structures, helped identify walls and foundations that were invisible from above. Global positioning systems allowed divers to record the exact location of every artifact with centimeter-level precision. Without these tools, finding Heracleion would have been like searching for a needle in a haystack the size of a small country, while blindfolded, underwater, in the murk. Godio's team used a nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometer, an instrument sensitive enough to detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by buried metal objects. This allowed them to locate bronze statues, iron anchors, and other metallic artifacts beneath the sediment without excavating. The technology essentially gave them the ability to see through the seafloor, to perceive the ghosts of structures that had been invisible to the naked eye for more than a millennium. The contrast between the ancient and the modern is striking. The people who built Heracleion had no sonar, no satellites, no magnetometers. They built with their hands, with rope and lever and stone. They navigated by the stars and the coastline. They measured depth by lowering weighted lines into the water, and yet they constructed a city so substantial, so thoroughly engineered, that its remains are still recognizable more than 2,000 years later. The technology that found Heracleion is extraordinary, but the technology that built it was, in its own way, equally so. The recovery process itself is a story of extraordinary logistical complexity. Raising a 5-meter granite statue from the seafloor is not a matter of attaching a rope and pulling. The statue of Happy weighed several tons. It had been resting in soft sediment for more than a millennium, and the sediment had formed a natural seal around it. Removing the statue required first excavating the surrounding material by hand, using water dredges to gently clear the silt without damaging the surface of the stone. Then a custom-built lifting frame had to be positioned over the statue, and straps were carefully placed around the figure at points calculated to distribute the weight evenly. The lift had to be slow and controlled, because any sudden movement could crack stone that had been weakened by centuries of immersion. The entire operation took days. Divers worked in shifts, limited by the amount of time they could safely spend at depth. Even at 10 meters, nitrogen absorption is a concern during prolonged dives, and decompression protocols had to be observed. Weather windows were narrow. Strong currents or poor visibility could halt work for days at a time, and all of this was happening not in a controlled laboratory environment, but in the open sea, subject to every whim of wind, wave, and tide. Once raised, the artifacts faced a new set of challenges. Objects that have been submerged in salt water for centuries undergo chemical changes. Salt crystals infiltrate the porous structure of stone and metal. If the artifact is allowed to dry too quickly, those crystals expand and can shatter the object from within. Every item recovered from Heracleion had to be immediately placed in desalination tanks, where it would soak in progressively less salty water for months or even years. The bronze statuettes, the gold coins, the limestone blocks, each required a specific conservation protocol tailored to its material and condition. The conservation team working alongside Godio's divers included specialists from multiple countries and disciplines. Chemists analyzed the corrosion products on metal surfaces. Conservators stabilized fragile wood from ancient ship hulls using polyethylene glycol, a waxy substance that replaces water in the cellular structure of waterlogged timber. Epigraphers, specialists in ancient inscriptions, worked to read and record hieroglyphs and Greek texts before further erosion rendered them illegible. The project was not just an excavation, it was a rescue operation, a race against the slow but relentless forces of marine decay. One of the most significant finds from the site was a black granite stele, a large inscribed slab, that bore a decree identical to one found at Naphthys, another ancient Egyptian site. The Naphthys stele had been known to scholars for years, but its provenance was uncertain. The discovery of the matching stele at Heracleion confirmed the identification of the underwater site as the city of Thonis Heracleion, and provided crucial information about the city's administrative functions. The decree, issued by Pharaoh Nectanebo I, imposed a 10% tax on Greek goods passing through the city. This was not merely a trading post. It was a customs station with the full weight of pharaonic authority behind it. The stele also confirmed that the Egyptian name for the city was Thonis, and that Heracleion was the Greek name for the same place. This dual identity had been suspected by scholars for decades, but the physical proof had been lacking until the stele was pulled from the Mediterranean mud. The inscription effectively merged two separate entries in the historical record into one, doubling our understanding of the city's role in ancient geopolitics. The ships discovered at the site are equally revealing. Among the more than 60 ancient vessels found in and around the harbour, one type stands out in particular. It is a type of Egyptian riverboat known as a baris, described by Herodotus in his histories but never previously identified in the archaeological record. Herodotus wrote that Egyptian shipbuilders constructed boats by stacking short planks in a brick-like pattern and stitching them together with long internal ribs. For centuries, scholars debated whether this description was accurate, or whether Herodotus had misunderstood what he saw. The discovery of an intact baris hull at Heracleion proved that Herodotus was right. The construction method matched his description almost exactly. A 2,400-year-old literary account was vindicated by a 21st century underwater discovery. This is worth pausing on. A Greek historian writing in the 5th century before the Common Era described a type of boat. For 2,400 years, no one could verify his claim. Then a team of divers found one of those boats on the bottom of the Mediterranean, its planks still holding together, its construction technique still legible in the waterlogged wood. The past does not always stay lost. Sometimes the evidence is merely waiting, buried in sediment, preserved in the quiet dark, patient beyond all human comprehension. There is a final point about scale that deserves emphasis. The Mediterranean Sea, at its widest, stretches roughly 3,860 kilometers from the Strait of Gibraltar to the coast of Lebanon. Its total surface area is approximately 2.5 million square kilometers. The total area that has been surveyed with the kind of detailed sonar mapping used at Heracleion represents a tiny fraction of that total. We know about Heracleion because Godio went looking for it. We know about the submerged ruins of Baiae because Italian archaeologists mapped them decades ago. We know about the Antikythera shipwreck because Greek sponge divers stumbled upon it more than a century ago. But the vast majority of the Mediterranean seafloor has never been surveyed at archaeological resolution. The ruins that have been found represent what the beam of a flashlight reveals in a darkened warehouse. The rest of the warehouse is still dark. How many other Heracleions are out there? How many ports, how many temples, how many cities lie beneath the Mediterranean mud, their names erased from history, their ruins undetected by sonar? The honest answer is that we do not know. We cannot know. The technology exists to find them, but the resources to deploy that technology across the entire Mediterranean do not. The sea is too large, the funding is too small, and the clock continues to tick. Because every year that passes, every current that shifts, every storm that scours the seabed, the remains become a little harder to read, a little more decayed, a little closer to being gone forever. Consider one more comparison to appreciate the difficulty of what Godio achieved. The search area in Abu Qir Bay covers roughly 110 square kilometers of seafloor. That is an area roughly equivalent to the land area of the city of Paris. Now imagine that Paris is underwater, buried in mud, invisible from the surface, and you have been given a boat, a sonar array, and a small team of divers. Your task is to find specific buildings within that area, determine their original function, and recover artifacts without damaging them. The task is, by any reasonable measure, absurd. And yet Goddio and his team have been doing it, methodically and successfully, for more than a quarter of a century. The discoveries they have made are a triumph of persistence over impossibility. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling. The core problem with Heracleion is not that it sank. Cities have been lost to the sea before. The core problem is the nature of the forgetting. How does an entire civilization lose track of one of its most important cities? How does a port that served as the gateway to Egypt, a port mentioned by Herodotus and Diodorus and Strabo, a port where pharaohs collected taxes and priests performed sacred rites, simply vanish from the collective memory of the human race? The answer lies in the way civilizations keep records and the fragility of those records. Ancient Egypt maintained extensive written archives, carved into stone, written on papyrus, inscribed on temple walls. But papyrus decays. Stone can be submerged, buried, or repurposed. Temple walls can be dismantled by later builders looking for construction material. And when a city sinks beneath the waves, it takes its inscriptions with it. The records of Heracleon's importance were not stored in some distant archive, safe on high ground. Many of them were in the city itself. When the city went under, so did the evidence of its own significance. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the ancient world. Cities that maintain their own records are vulnerable to total informational collapse when those cities are destroyed. Troy was dismissed as myth until Heinrich Schliemann excavated it in the 1870s. The Minoan civilization on Crete was unknown until Arthur Evans began digging at Knossos in 1900. The Indus Valley civilization, one of the largest urban cultures of the ancient world, was not recognized by modern archaeology until the 1920s. In each case, a major center of human activity was forgotten for centuries or millennia, its existence preserved only in fragmentary references that most scholars dismissed as exaggeration or fiction. Heracleion fits this pattern precisely. The references existed. Herodotus, writing around 440 before the Common Era, described how the legendary Helen of Troy and her companion Paris visited a temple of Heracles at the mouth of the Nile. The story placed a temple and a settlement at a specific geographic location. Other ancient sources corroborated the existence of a major port city near the canopic mouth of the Nile. Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, mentioned Heracleion alongside Canopus as a significant coastal settlement. Diodorus Siculus referenced it as well, but references are not proof. Ancient writers were known to blend fact with myth, history with legend. Herodotus himself was sometimes called the father of lies as well as the father of history. Without physical evidence, the textual references to Heracleion could be, and were, dismissed as literary embellishments. The city was real, but its reality was buried under the double weight of water and skepticism. The rediscovery process itself reveals how difficult it is to find what the ocean has hidden. Frank Goddio did not stumble upon Heracleion by accident. He spent years searching. His initial surveys of Abu Qir Bay began in 1996, 4 years before the major discovery. During those early years, his team was primarily looking for shipwrecks related to the Battle of the Nile, the naval engagement in 1798, where the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet anchored in the bay. Napoleon's flagship, the Orient, had exploded and sunk during that battle, and its remains were known to be somewhere in the bay. It was while searching for Napoleonic-era wreckage that Goddio's team began detecting anomalies on the seafloor that did not match the profile of a late 18th century warship. The anomalies were too large, too dispersed, and too regular in their distribution. They looked like walls, they looked like foundations, they looked like the layout of a city. Goddio shifted the focus of his survey, and within months, the full scope of what lay beneath the bay began to emerge. The moment of recognition must have been extraordinary. Imagine spending years looking for one thing, and finding something else entirely, something vastly older and more significant than what you were searching for. Imagine running your sonar across the seafloor and watching the display paint a picture not of a sunken warship, but of a sunken world. Streets, harbours, temples, a city grid extending for kilometres in every direction. The feeling must have been something like terror mixed with wonder, the vertigo of confronting a piece of history so large and so well hidden that the entire modern world had overlooked it. And it gets worse, because the more Godio's team excavated, the clearer it became that Heracleion was not just a port. It was a religious centre of enormous importance. The Temple of Amun at Heracleion was not a minor provincial shrine. It was a major temple complex, comparable in significance to the great temples at Karnak and Luxor. Pilgrims travelled to Heracleion, specifically to worship at this temple. Rituals performed there were considered essential to the spiritual life of the nation. The pharaoh himself participated in ceremonies at the temple, ceremonies that marked his divine right to rule. The evidence for this came from the artifacts themselves. The Nawas of Nectanebo I, the sacred shrine recovered from the temple site, bore inscriptions that detailed religious obligations and offerings. The shrine was carved from a single block of pink granite, a stone quarried hundreds of kilometers upstream at Aswan and transported down the Nile to the coast. The effort required to carve, transport, and install such an object was enormous. It speaks to the importance that the Egyptian state placed on this particular temple at this particular location. Other religious artifacts reinforce the picture. Dozens of bronze statuettes of Osiris, the god of the dead and the afterlife, were found scattered across the temple precinct. Lead model boats, likely used in votive ceremonies, were recovered from the harbour area. Stone basins that once held sacred oils were found in what appeared to be priests' quarters. The religious infrastructure of Heracleion was extensive, well-funded, and central to Egyptian spiritual practice. This raises a deeply troubling question. If Heracleion was this important, religiously and commercially, then its loss would have been felt across the entire Egyptian world. The disappearance of a major temple of Amun would have been like the disappearance of a cathedral in medieval Europe. It should have been recorded. It should have been mourned. There should be text somewhere, on papyrus or stone, describing the catastrophe that claimed the city and the efforts made to save its sacred objects. But no such texts have been found. The silence is complete. One possible explanation is that the decline of Heracleion was gradual enough to allow an orderly transfer of functions to Alexandria. As Alexandria grew in power and importance during the Ptolemaic period, beginning in the late 4th century before the Common Era, Heracleion may have slowly lost its commercial and religious dominance. Ships that once had to pass through Heracleion began using Alexandria's superior harbour instead. Priests may have relocated their rituals. Merchants may have shifted their warehouses. By the time the physical city finally succumbed to the sea, it may already have been a shadow of its former self, important enough to mourn but not important enough to record. But this explanation has problems. The archaeological evidence shows that Heracleion continued to be occupied and active well into the Roman period, long after Alexandria had become the dominant port. Coins from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era have been found at the site. New construction appears to have been undertaken during this period, suggesting that people were still investing in the city's infrastructure, even as the ground beneath it was slowly giving way. Heracleion did not die quietly. It was still alive, still functioning, still receiving ships, even as the waters crept higher. The more likely explanation is that the final submersion was sudden enough to preclude documentation, but slow enough in its build-up to allow most of the population to evacuate. Imagine living in a coastal city where the streets flood a little more with each passing year. At first, you build seawalls, then you raise your floors, then you move to higher ground within the city limits. And then, one night, an earthquake shakes the already saturated ground, and the entire district you grew up in drops 2 meters in a matter of minutes. The water rushes in. The buildings crack and topple. You flee with nothing but the clothes on your back, and you never go back, because there is nothing to go back to. This scenario is consistent with the archaeological evidence. The ruins show signs of both gradual decline and sudden catastrophe. Some buildings appear to have been deliberately abandoned, their contents removed before the water arrived. Others show signs of violent collapse, their walls fallen in ways that suggest sudden structural failure rather than gradual decay. The picture is of a city in chronic distress, slowly losing its battle with the sea, and then losing it all at once. The chronology of the final submersion is still debated. Most scholars place it somewhere between the 6th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, a period that coincides with known seismic activity in the eastern Mediterranean and with significant changes in the course of the Nile's branches. The canopic branch, which had been the lifeblood of Heracleion for centuries, may have shifted its course during this period, depriving the city of fresh water and further destabilizing the already weakened ground. Without the river, the city had no reason to exist. Without stable ground, it had no ability to exist. The combination was lethal. There is another dimension to this story that is worth exploring, and it concerns the role of the Mediterranean itself as a keeper of secrets. The Mediterranean is sometimes called a closed sea, meaning that it has limited connection to the wider ocean. The Strait of Gibraltar, roughly 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, is the only natural passage connecting the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. This relative isolation gives the Mediterranean distinct characteristics. Its tidal range is minimal, typically less than 1 meter in most areas. Its salinity is higher than the Atlantic's because evaporation exceeds freshwater input. Its water circulates slowly, taking roughly 100 years to fully exchange through the Strait of Gibraltar. These characteristics have important implications for underwater preservation. The higher salinity of the Mediterranean accelerates certain types of corrosion but inhibits others. The minimal tidal range means that submerged ruins are not subjected to the constant exposure and re-immersion that would destroy them in a tidal environment. The slow circulation means that deep sediment layers are relatively undisturbed. In some ways, the Mediterranean is an ideal environment for preserving underwater ruins, better than the open ocean, where stronger currents and more violent storms would scatter remains across wide areas. This is why the Mediterranean contains more known underwater archaeological sites than any other body of water on Earth. From the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1900, to the submerged ruins of Baiae, the Roman resort town now lying beneath the Bay of Naples, to the Bronze Age shipwrecks found off the coast of Turkey, the Mediterranean is a museum without walls. Its collections are measured not in rooms, but in square kilometers. Heracleion is the largest exhibit in that museum, but it is far from the only one. Canopus, the city that Strabo mentioned alongside Heracleion, also lies submerged in Abu Qir Bay, just a few kilometers from the ruins of its more famous neighbor. Godio's team has explored Canopus as well, finding temples, statues, and artifacts that mirror those found at Heracleion. The two cities appear to have been closely linked, forming a dual port system that controlled access to the Nile Delta. When one sank, the other followed. The bay claimed them both. Further east, the ancient port city of Meneuthis also lies submerged, completing a trio of lost cities in the same stretch of Egyptian coastline. 3 cities, each mentioned in ancient texts, each dismissed by later scholars as myth or exaggeration, each found by modern archaeologists on the bottom of the same bay. The concentration is extraordinary. It suggests that the geological instability of the Nile Delta was not a localized problem affecting one unlucky settlement, but a regional catastrophe that claimed entire coastal systems. The implications of this pattern extend beyond archaeology. If 3 major ancient cities could sink beneath the Mediterranean in the same region, what does that say about the stability of modern coastal settlements in the same area? Alexandria, Egypt's second largest city, sits just a few kilometers from the ruins of Heracleion. Its population exceeds 5 million. Its elevation is barely above sea level, and the same geological forces that destroyed Heracleion, subsidence, liquefaction, sea level fluctuation, have not stopped operating. They continue today, measured by satellites, tracked by geologists, worried over by urban planners. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the permanence of coastal cities. We build on coastlines as if the boundary between land and sea were fixed. It is not. It never has been. The Mediterranean has been advancing and retreating along the Egyptian coast for thousands of years, and Heracleion is merely the most dramatic proof that the sea does not respect human construction, no matter how grand. The religious dimension of Heracleion's loss adds another layer of meaning. In ancient Egyptian belief, the gods were not abstract concepts dwelling in some distant heaven. They were present in their temples, inhabiting the statues and shrines created for them. The temple of Amun at Heracleion was not merely a place where people prayed. It was, in the Egyptian understanding, a place where the god himself dwelt. When the temple sank beneath the waves, the god's earthly home was destroyed. The ritual connection between the divine and the human was severed. For a civilization that understood its entire political and social order as resting on the favor of the gods, the loss of such a temple would have been not just a practical disaster, but a cosmic one. The statue of Hapi recovered by Gaudio stands today in museums, clean and illuminated under gallery lights. Visitors admire its craftsmanship. They read the information plaques. They move on to the next exhibit. But for the people who carved it and installed it in its temple, this statue was not art. It was a living presence. It was the physical form of a god who controlled the most important natural event in Egyptian life, the annual flooding of the Nile. When that statue slipped beneath the water, it was not a loss of property. It was the drowning of a deity. Let us return to the physical remains and examine what they tell us about daily life in Heracleion, because the tragedy of a lost city is measured not only in temples and statues, but in the ordinary objects that ordinary people left behind. Among the thousands of artifacts recovered from the site are items that paint a vivid picture of a working port city. Oil lamps, the kind that would have illuminated a merchant's desk or a sailor's bunk. Ceramic vessels for storing grain, wine, and olive oil. Weights and measures used in commercial transactions. Fishing hooks, cooking pots, perfume bottles. These are not the treasures of kings. They are the possessions of people who lived and worked and ate and slept in a city that no longer exists. The fishing hooks are particularly poignant. They tell us that people sat on the docks of Heracleion and dropped lines into the harbour, waiting for a catch, just as fishermen do in every port city in the world today. They tell us that the sea that would eventually swallow the city was also, in better times, a source of food and livelihood. The relationship between Heracleion and the Mediterranean was not one of simple opposition, city versus sea. It was a relationship of dependence. The city needed the sea for trade, for food, for its very identity as a port. And the sea, in its own blind, geological way, needed the city's unstable ground to continue its relentless advance. The weapons found at the site tell another story. Bronze swords, arrowheads, the remains of what appear to be defensive structures along the harbour walls. Heracleion was not merely a commercial and religious centre. It was a military installation. Its position at the mouth of the Nile made it a natural choke point, a place where an invading fleet could be intercepted before it reached the heart of Egypt. The Persians understood this when they invaded Egypt in 525 before the Common Era under King Cambyses II. The Greeks understood it when Alexander the Great arrived in 332 before the Common Era. Every power that sought to control Egypt had to deal with the port at the mouth of the Nile, and for most of Egypt's ancient history, that port was Heracleion. The strategic importance of the city explains why it was so heavily built. The harbour walls were massive, constructed from stone blocks weighing several tons each. The temple foundations were deep and broad, designed to support structures of considerable height and weight. The canal system that connected the harbour to the Nile was engineered with locks and gates that allowed the regulation of water flow. This was not a city that grew organically, one hut at a time. This was a city that was planned and built with the resources of a state, designed to serve as the front door of one of the wealthiest and most powerful civilizations in the ancient world. The canal system deserves particular attention because it reveals the sophisticated hydraulic engineering that the Egyptians were capable of. The canals of Heracleion connected the Mediterranean harbour to the Canopic branch of the Nile, creating an inland waterway that allowed goods to be transferred from seagoing vessels to river barges without unloading. This was an enormous logistical advantage. A ship arriving from Athens or Tyre could unload its cargo directly onto a Nile barge, which would then carry it upstream to Memphis, Thebes, or any other destination along the river. The system was efficient, elegant, and centuries ahead of anything comparable in the Mediterranean world. The remains of this canal system are still visible in the archaeological record, traceable as linear depressions in the seafloor sediment. The canals were lined with stone to prevent erosion, and sections of that stone lining have survived intact. The engineering is precise. The canals maintain a consistent width and depth over their surveyed length, suggesting that they were built according to a carefully calculated plan. Whoever designed the canal system of Heracleion had a sophisticated understanding of water flow, sediment management, and structural engineering, and yet, the very canals that made Heracleion prosperous may have contributed to its downfall. By channeling water through and around the city, the canal system may have increased the saturation of the already unstable ground beneath the foundations. Every time the Nile flooded, water would have surged through the canals, carrying fresh sediment and raising the water table beneath the city. Over centuries, this repeated saturation would have progressively weakened the ground, making it more susceptible to liquefaction. The infrastructure that sustained Heracleion may have been imperceptibly, and over a very long time, undermining the ground it stood on. This is a pattern that recurs throughout history. The very things that make a city great are often the things that eventually destroy it. Venice, built on wooden pilings driven into a lagoon, is sinking under the weight of the tourism that sustains its economy. New Orleans, built in a river delta below sea level, is protected by levees that prevent the natural sediment deposition that would otherwise raise the ground level. Mexico City, built on the drained bed of a lake, is subsiding at rates of up to 30 centimeters per year as the aquifer beneath it is pumped dry. In each case, the relationship between the city and its environment contains the seeds of the city's eventual crisis. Heracleion was no different. Its position at the mouth of the Nile gave it wealth and power. That same position placed it on the most geologically unstable stretch of coastline in the eastern Mediterranean. Its canal system made it an efficient port. That same canal system accelerated the saturation of its foundations. Its massive stone buildings made it impressive and durable. That same mass pressed down on ground that could not in the end bear the weight. The story of Heracleion is not simply a story of natural disaster. It is a story about the relationship between human ambition and geological reality. The people who built Heracleion were not ignorant. They were skilled engineers and architects who built structures that have survived for more than 2,000 years, even underwater. But they were working with an incomplete understanding of the ground beneath their feet. They could not measure subsidence rates. They could not model the fluid dynamics of saturated sediment. They did not have seismographs to warn them of impending earthquakes. They built the best city they could with the knowledge they had, and the knowledge was not enough. The parallels to the modern world are uncomfortable. We build cities on coastlines, in floodplains, on fault lines, and in river deltas, confident that our technology can protect us from the forces that destroyed cities like Heracleion. We build seawalls and levees and drainage systems. We monitor subsidence from space. We model earthquake risk with supercomputers. But the force is the same. The ground still sinks. The sea still rises. Earthquakes still strike without warning. The question is not whether our technology is better than that of the ancient Egyptians. The question is whether it is good enough. The archaeological site of Heracleion continues to yield discoveries. In 2013, Godio's team announced the discovery of a fast galley, a warship designed for speed and maneuverability in the harbour area. The vessel was remarkably well preserved, its hull still intact enough to reveal details of its construction technique. In subsequent years, additional structures were identified on the periphery of the known site, suggesting that the city was even larger than initially estimated. A cemetery was discovered, containing both Egyptian and Greek burial styles, further evidence of the multicultural character of the city. Each new discovery adds detail to the picture. Each new artifact extends the story, and each new season of excavation reminds us how much remains unknown. The site is vast, and the resources available for excavation are finite. Gaudio and his team have been working at Heracleion for more than 25 years, and they have barely scratched the surface. The city has more to reveal. The question is whether we will reach it before the Mediterranean finishes the job of erasing it. The question of what happened to the population of Heracleion haunts the archaeological record. There are no mass graves at the site, no concentrations of human remains, no evidence of the kind of catastrophic, instantaneous death that characterizes sites like Pompeii, where bodies were preserved in the positions they died. This absence suggests that the people of Heracleion had time to leave. They saw the water rising. They felt the ground shifting. They gathered what they could carry, and they walked away. Where did they go? The most likely answer is Alexandria. By the time Heracleion entered its final decline, Alexandria was already the dominant city of the Nile Delta, a sprawling metropolis with a population of hundreds of thousands and the most famous library in the ancient world. The refugees of Heracleion would have been absorbed into Alexandria's population, bringing with them their skills, their memories, and perhaps some of their portable wealth. Within a generation, the distinct identity of Heracleon's people would have dissolved into the larger identity of Alexandrian culture. Within 2 generations, the city's name would have begun to fade from common usage. Within 3, it would have become a story that grandparents told to children who were not quite sure whether to believe it. This is how cities die in the memory of the world, not with a dramatic final act, but with a slow erosion of relevance. First the population leaves, then the trade routes shift, then the records stop being updated. Then the last person who remembers the city's streets dies, and the name passes into the realm of scholars and antiquarians who argue about whether it was real. And then, centuries later, someone points a magnetometer at the seafloor, and the argument is settled. But by then, the city has been gone so long that its rediscovery feels less like a reunion, and more like an encounter with a ghost. The textual evidence that does survive is tantalizing in its brevity. A stele from the reign of Ptolemy VIII, dating to roughly 118 before the Common Era, refers to Heracleion in terms that suggest it was still a functioning port at that date. A late Roman source mentions Thonis as a place of some note, though the context is unclear. After that silence, no Byzantine texts mention the city, no Arab geographers describe it, no Crusader maps mark its location. It is as if someone drew a line across the historical record and said, beyond this point, Heracleion does not exist. The French campaign in Egypt at the end of the 18th century brought European scholars to the Nile Delta in large numbers for the first time. Napoleon's expedition included dozens of scientists, artists, and engineers who documented the antiquities of Egypt with unprecedented thoroughness. They mapped temples, they sketched hieroglyphs, they measured pyramids, but they did not find Heracleion. They could not. The city was 6.5 kilometers offshore, beneath 10 meters of water and several meters of sediment. The technology to detect it would not exist for another 200 years. Even when that technology did arrive, finding Heracleion required more than equipment. It required imagination. It required someone willing to take the ancient text seriously, to assume that Herodotus and Strabo were describing a real place, and to go looking for it with modern tools. Gaudio was that person. His decision to survey Abu Qir Bay was driven not by accident but by a systematic reading of the ancient sources and a conviction that the texts pointed to a specific area of the seafloor. He was right. The texts were right. The city was there, exactly where the ancients said it would be, waiting beneath the waves for someone with the right combination of scholarship and technology to find it. The most recent phases of excavation have focused on the harbour area, where the concentration of shipwrecks is densest. The harbour of Heracleion was not a simple anchorage. It was a complex system of basins, channels, and quays designed to accommodate vessels of different sizes and purposes. Warships were moored in one area, merchant vessels in another, river barges in a third. The layout is legible in the archaeological record, and it tells a story of a port that was organised with military precision. Every berth had its function. Every channel was sized for a specific class of vessel, The planners of Heracleion thought about their harbour the way modern urban planners think about traffic flow, with an eye toward efficiency, capacity, and control. Among the shipwrecks, the variety of vessel types is notable. Some are clearly Egyptian in construction, with the brick-like planking pattern described by Herodotus. Others show Greek construction techniques, with mortise and tenon joinery holding the hull planks together. Still, others appear to be hybrid designs, blending Egyptian and Greek methods in ways that suggest the shipwrights of Heracleion were drawing on multiple traditions. This multicultural approach to shipbuilding mirrors the multicultural character of the city itself. Heracleion was a meeting point, a place where different ways of doing things came together and influenced each other. The presence of so many wrecks in the harbour also tells us something about the circumstances of the city's end. Ships do not normally accumulate in a harbour. They arrive, unload, and depart. A harbour full of sunken vessels suggests that something prevented those ships from leaving. Perhaps they were trapped by a sudden collapse of the harbour walls. Perhaps a storm surge drove them against each other. Perhaps the ground beneath the harbour itself dropped, pulling the moored vessels down with it. Whatever happened, it happened fast enough that the ships could not escape. Imagine that moment, the harbour of Heracleion, full of ships from across the Mediterranean, the crews going about their business, loading cargo, repairing rigging, negotiating with customs officials. And then the ground moves, the water surges, the stone quays crack and tilt. Ships that were floating freely are suddenly pinned against collapsing walls or dragged down by shifting sediment. The shouts of sailors mix with the groan of breaking timber and the roar of displaced water, and then, gradually, silence. The water settles. The ships rest on the bottom. The harbour that was built to shelter them becomes their grave. This image is not speculation. It is the most straightforward reading of the physical evidence. The ships of Heracleion did not sink at sea in storms. They sank in their harbour, at their moorings, which means they sank because the harbour itself failed. The infrastructure that was designed to protect them was the instrument of their destruction. There is a grim symmetry in that. The city that lived by the sea died by the sea, in the very waters it had shaped and channeled and controlled. There is one more artifact that deserves mention before we move deeper into this story. Among the smaller objects recovered from the temple precinct was a set of gold plaques, thin sheets of gold inscribed in both Greek and Egyptian, recording dedications to the gods of the temple. These plaques were offerings left by worshippers who sought divine favour. They are personal in a way that the colossal statues and massive stelae are not. They carry the hopes of individual people, written in gold and placed in a temple that those people believed would stand forever. The gold has survived. The temple has not. The hopes are unreadable except artifacts in a museum case, separated from their context by 1,200 years of salt water and silence. Each of these golden prayers was placed by a hand that trembled with devotion. Each was left by a person who walked through the streets of Heracleion, who smelled the harbour, who heard the gulls, who believed in the permanence of the world around them. And each is now a relic of a world that no longer exists, recovered from a darkness that no one who made those offerings ever imagined. The weight of that realization is difficult to bear, not because it is tragic in the ordinary sense, though it is, but because it is universal. Every city, every temple, every monument that human hands have ever built exists on the same terms as Heracleion, temporarily. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The story of Heracleion does not exist in isolation. It is part of a much larger pattern of lost places, submerged mysteries, and underwater phenomena that challenge our understanding of the planet we inhabit. To fully appreciate what the drowned city means, we need to examine it alongside other deep-sea mysteries and submerged anomalies that have reshaped what we think we know about the world beneath the waves. Each of these mysteries has been investigated, each has yielded partial answers, and each, in its own way, has revealed the limits of human knowledge when confronted with the vast, dark, patient ocean. The first mystery worth examining is the phenomenon of hydrothermal vents, the volcanic chimneys that rise from the ocean floor along mid-ocean ridges and support ecosystems that exist entirely without sunlight. Hydrothermal vents were first discovered in 1977 by a team of geologists aboard the research submersible Alvin, operating near the Galapagos Rift in the Pacific Ocean. What they found was astonishing. At a depth of roughly 2,500 meters, in water that should have been nearly lifeless, they encountered a thriving community of organisms clustered around jets of superheated water erupting from the seafloor. Giant tube worms, some more than 2 meters long, waved in the current. Clams the size of dinner plates clustered around the base of the vents. Shrimp swarmed in water that exceeded 300 degrees Celsius at the point of emission. The discovery overturned a fundamental assumption of biology, that all life on Earth ultimately depends on sunlight for energy. The organisms at hydrothermal vents derive their energy not from photosynthesis but from chemosynthesis, a process in which bacteria convert hydrogen sulfide and other chemicals dissolved in the vent fluid into organic compounds. These bacteria form the base of a food chain that supports the tube worms, the clams, the shrimp, and dozens of other species, all thriving in perpetual darkness, under crushing pressure, in water saturated with chemicals that would be toxic to most surface organisms. The relevance to Heracleion is not immediately obvious, but it is profound. The discovery of hydrothermal vent ecosystems demonstrated that the ocean floor is not the barren wasteland that scientists once assumed. It is alive, in ways that the surface world never expected. If entire ecosystems can exist at depths where no sunlight penetrates, in temperatures that would scald human flesh, under pressures that would crush a submarine, then our assumptions about what the ocean can and cannot support need to be fundamentally revised. The same ocean floor that preserves the ruins of Heracleion also harbours life forms that belong to an entirely different biological paradigm. The unexplored depths contain not only the artifacts of human civilization, but also the living products of processes we are only beginning to understand. The second mystery is the phenomenon of brine pools, which are among the strangest features of the ocean floor. A brine pool is a body of water at the bottom of the ocean that is so much saltier than the surrounding seawater that it forms a distinct layer, complete with its own surface, its own shoreline, and its own waves. From the perspective of a submarine hovering above one, a brine pool looks like an underwater lake, a body of water within a body of water. The salt concentration in these pools can be 3 to 5 times that of normal seawater. The water is so dense that a submarine can float on it. The chemistry is so extreme that most organisms that enter the pool die almost instantly. Brine pools have been found in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Mediterranean, and in the Red Sea. They form when ancient salt deposits buried beneath the seafloor dissolve, and the resulting hypersaline water seeps up through cracks and collects in depressions. The edges of brine pools are often ringed by beds of mussels and tube worms that have adapted to the extreme conditions, living right at the boundary between the lethal brine and the survivable seawater above. These boundary communities are another example of life adapting to conditions that should, by any reasonable standard, be uninhabitable. The existence of brine pools in the Mediterranean is particularly relevant to the story of Heracleion. The Mediterranean seafloor is underlain by massive salt deposits, remnants of a period when the sea may have partially or fully evaporated. The same geological forces that created those salt deposits also shaped the sedimentary environment in which Heracleion was built. The ground beneath the Nile Delta is rich in salt, and the interaction between salt water, fresh water, and salt-bearing sediments is one of the factors that makes the delta so geologically unstable. The ocean floor beneath and around Heracleion is not a simple inert surface. It is a dynamic chemical environment where salt, water, and sediment interact in ways that can weaken foundations, dissolve stone, and accelerate the decay of buried artifacts. The third mystery takes us in a different direction entirely. Off the southern coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, lies a submerged rock formation that has sparked one of the most contentious debates in underwater archaeology. The Yonaguni Monument, as it is commonly known, consists of a series of flat terraces, sharp edges, and right-angled steps carved into a submerged rock outcrop at a depth of roughly 25 meters. When it was first reported by a diver named Kihachiro Aratake in 1986, the formation appeared so regular, so geometric, that many observers immediately concluded it must be artificial, the remains of a man-made structure submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. The debate over Yonaguni has raged for decades. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, has argued that the formation shows clear evidence of human modification, including what he interprets as carved channels, a staircase, and a platform resembling the base of a ziggurat. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, has argued the opposite, that the formation is entirely natural, the product of the distinctive fracture patterns of the local sandstone, which tends to break along flat planes and right angles. The numbers are striking. The main formation measures roughly 100 meters long and 25 meters tall. Some of the flat surfaces are more than 20 meters wide. The steps are regular enough to suggest intentional shaping, but natural geological processes, particularly the erosion of bedded sandstone along joint plains, can produce similar features without any human intervention. The Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, with its perfectly hexagonal basalt columns, is a reminder that nature is fully capable of producing geometry that looks designed. The relevance to Heracleion is this. The Yonaguni debate illustrates how difficult it is to distinguish between natural and human-made structures underwater. On land, the distinction is usually straightforward. A carved stone block looks different from a natural boulder. A wall looks different from a cliff face. But underwater, the picture is muddied by marine growth, sediment accumulation, and erosion. Surfaces that were once clearly carved may be smoothed by centuries of water action. Edges that were once sharp may be rounded by biological encrustation. The criteria that archaeologists use on land to identify human construction do not always apply beneath the waves. Gaudio and his team at Heracleion had the advantage of context. The objects they found, the statues, the inscriptions, the coins, the temple furniture, left no doubt that they were dealing with a human settlement, but not all underwater sites are so unambiguous. Between the clear artificiality of Heracleion and the disputed geology of Yonaguni lies a vast grey area of submerged formations that might be natural, might be human-made, and might be something in between. The ocean does not make these distinctions easy. The fourth mystery concerns the deep-sea creatures that seem to defy the physical constraints of their environment. At depths below 1,000 meters, where the pressure exceeds 100 atmospheres and the temperature hovers near freezing, life should, by surface world logic, be sparse and simple. Instead, the deep ocean hosts an astonishing diversity of organisms, many of which exhibit adaptations that border on the surreal. The barrel-eye fish, which lives at depths of roughly 600 to 800 meters, has a transparent head through which it can look directly upward, scanning for the silhouettes of prey against the faint light filtering down from above. The vampire squid, found at depths of 600 to 1,200 meters, can turn itself inside out as a defensive mechanism, exposing a forest of fleshy spines that deter predators. The anglerfish uses a bioluminescent lure, a modified dorsal fin spine, tipped with light-producing bacteria, to attract prey in the absolute darkness. These organisms are not mere curiosities. They are evidence of the ocean's capacity to support complex life in conditions that would be fatal to any surface organism. The pressure, the darkness, the cold, the scarcity of food, none of these factors have prevented the deep ocean from generating forms of life that are as varied and as sophisticated as anything found on land. If the ocean can produce transparent-headed fish and inside-out squid, what else is it capable of that we have not yet discovered? The connection to Heracleion is philosophical rather than biological. The drowned city and the deep-sea creatures are both products of the same ocean, an ocean that is vast enough, complex enough, and old enough to contain entire worlds that the surface has never seen. The ruins of Heracleion were hidden for 1,200 years. The creatures of the deep ocean were hidden for far longer. Both were discovered only when technology advanced to the point where the ocean's darkness could be penetrated. Both revealed that the world beneath the waves is far more complex, far more populated, and far more significant than anyone on the surface had assumed. The fifth and final mystery in this survey concerns the phenomenon of missing ships and unexplained disappearances in certain regions of the ocean. The most famous of these regions is the area of the western North Atlantic, commonly known as the Bermuda Triangle, bounded roughly by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. Over the decades, hundreds of ships and aircraft have been reported missing in this area, and a rich mythology has grown up around the disappearances, attributing them to everything from magnetic anomalies to underwater alien bases. The reality, as with most such mysteries, is more prosaic. The Bermuda Triangle is one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes in the world. The number of disappearances, when adjusted for the volume of traffic, is not statistically unusual. Weather in the region is volatile, with sudden storms and waterspouts that can overwhelm small vessels. The Gulf Stream, a powerful ocean current that flows through the area, can disperse wreckage so quickly that search teams find nothing. Most of the famous Bermuda Triangle disappearances have mundane explanations: equipment failure, human error, severe weather that require no supernatural hypothesis. But the Bermuda Triangle legend persists because it speaks to a deeper truth about the ocean, a truth that Heracleion also embodies. The ocean takes things and does not give them back. Ships that sink in deep water may never be found. Cities that slip beneath the waves may not be rediscovered for millennia. The ocean is the largest repository of lost objects on Earth, and its inventory is growing every year. The Bermuda Triangle is not mysterious because things disappear there. It is mysterious because the ocean is the kind of place where things can disappear permanently, and we are uncomfortable with permanence of that kind. The connection between all five of these mysteries, the hydrothermal vents, the brine pools, Yonaguni, the deep-sea creatures, and the Bermuda Triangle, is that each one reveals a different facet of the ocean's capacity for concealment and surprise. The ocean hides life where there should be none. It hides chemistry that defies ordinary experience. It hides structures that may or may not be artificial. It hides organisms that look like they belong in science fiction. And it hides the remains of human civilization so thoroughly that the greatest port in ancient Egypt can be forgotten for over 1,000 years. But here is the problem. We keep treating these discoveries as isolated incidents, individual puzzles to be solved one at a time. The reality is that they are all symptoms of the same underlying condition, a condition that can be stated simply: we do not know our own planet. We have mapped the surface of Mars with greater resolution than we have mapped the floor of our own oceans. We have sent probes to the outer reaches of the solar system, but we have not sent cameras to the majority of the seafloor. The technology exists, the will does not. And while we look outward, the ocean beneath us continues to guard its secrets with the same patient, crushing indifference it has maintained for as long as water has covered this world. The implications for Heracleion are direct. If we cannot even survey the Mediterranean comprehensively, a relatively small, shallow, well-studied body of water, then how many other Heracleions are we missing? How many other cities, ports, temples, and settlements lie beneath the waves of larger, deeper, less accessible oceans? The answer, based on what we know about the history of coastal settlement and the dynamics of sea level change, is likely in the hundreds, possibly in the thousands. The human race has been building cities on coastlines for at least 8,000 years, and sea levels have fluctuated dramatically over that period. Every coastline that has been inundated by rising seas is potentially an archaeological site waiting to be discovered, and we have barely begun to look. This is not science fiction. This is geology, archaeology, and oceanography converging on a single, uncomfortable conclusion. The record of human civilization is incomplete, not slightly incomplete, radically incomplete. And the missing chapters are not lost in dusty archives or forgotten libraries. They are lost beneath the ocean, in the silt and the silence and the pressure. And recovering them will require a commitment of resources and imagination that the world has not yet shown. Consider the Mediterranean alone. Its coastline stretches for roughly 46,000 kilometers. Over the past 10,000 years, sea levels in the Mediterranean have risen by more than 100 meters in some areas. Every centimeter of that rise has pushed the shoreline inland, submerging whatever stood at the old waterline. Harbors, fishing villages, trading posts, military installations, all of them now underwater. The archaeological potential is staggering. The actual exploration, compared to that potential, is negligible. Godio's work at Heracleion has demonstrated what is possible when the right combination of technology, expertise, and funding is brought to bear on a specific underwater site. The results have been transformative. They have rewritten the history of ancient Egypt's maritime commerce. They have vindicated ancient authors whose accounts had been doubted. They have produced some of the most spectacular archaeological finds of the past century. And they have shown that the ocean is not merely a barrier to archaeological investigation, but a preservative, one that can keep artifacts in remarkable condition for thousands of years. But Godio's project is exceptional precisely because it is so rare. The number of underwater archaeological excavations operating worldwide at any given time can be counted on two hands. The funding available for such work is a fraction of what is spent on land-based archaeology. The expertise required, a combination of diving skills, archaeological training, conservation knowledge, and technological proficiency, is rare and expensive. The result is a situation in which the richest archaeological frontier on Earth is also the least explored. The situation is made more urgent by the fact that underwater archaeological sites are not static. They are actively deteriorating. At Heracleion, the combination of biological activity, current-driven erosion, and chemical dissolution is steadily degrading the remains. Inscriptions that were legible 20 years ago are less legible today. Stone surfaces that were intact a decade ago now show signs of biological boring, where marine organisms drill into the rock for shelter. Wooden artifacts, including the hulls of the ancient ships, are particularly vulnerable. Waterlogged wood that has been in stable conditions for centuries can begin to deteriorate rapidly once the equilibrium of its environment is disturbed, whether by changes in current patterns, shifts in sediment, or the simple passage of time. The conservation challenge is immense. You cannot build a fence around an underwater site. You cannot control the temperature, the salinity, or the current. You cannot keep marine organisms away. The best you can do is document everything as thoroughly as possible, recover the most vulnerable artifacts, and hope that the rest survives long enough for future generations to study it. At Heracleion, this approach has worked well, but it is a race against time, and time is not on the side of the archaeologists. Let us return to the question of what other submerged sites may exist in the Mediterranean and beyond. The ancient world was a maritime world. Trade routes crisscrossed every navigable body of water. Cities grew up wherever ships could find safe harbour. And harbours, by definition, are located at the interface between land and sea, precisely the zone most vulnerable to changes in sea level, coastal erosion, and tectonic subsidence. The ancient Phoenicians, the greatest mariners of the pre-classical world, established trading posts and colonies across the entire Mediterranean, from their homeland in modern Lebanon to the coasts of North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and beyond. Carthage, their most famous colony, is well known, but the Phoenicians also founded dozens of smaller settlements, many of which were located on low-lying coastal sites that would have been vulnerable to the same forces that destroyed Heracleion. How many of those settlements are now underwater? The Phoenician trading post of Motia on the island of San Pantaleo off the west coast of Sicily is partially submerged. The ancient harbour of Sidon in modern Lebanon has been inundated by centuries of relative sea level rise. The pattern is repeated up and down the Mediterranean coast. The Greeks were equally prolific coastal builders. From the 8th century before the Common Era onward, Greek colonists established cities on virtually every habitable coastline in the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Many of these cities were built on low-lying terrain near river mouths, exactly the same type of environment where Heracleion was built. The ancient Greek city of Pavlopetri, off the southern coast of the Peloponnese Peninsula, is considered one of the oldest known submerged cities in the world. It has been dated to roughly 3,000 years before the Common Era, making it at least 1,000 years older than Heracleion. Its streets, buildings, and tombs are visible on the seafloor at a depth of roughly 3 to 4 meters. Pavlopetri was discovered in 1967 and has since been mapped using photogrammetry and underwater surveying techniques. Like Heracleion, it tells the story of a coastal community that was claimed by the slow, relentless rise of the sea. The Roman world added another layer to the underwater record. The Romans were compulsive builders, and they built on an imperial scale. Harbours, warehouses, villas, and entire resort towns lined the Italian coast and the coasts of the Roman provinces. Many of these structures were built using a revolutionary material called Roman concrete, or opus caementicium, which incorporated volcanic ash and could set underwater. The Roman harbour at Caesarea Maritima in modern Israel was constructed using this technique and represents one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the ancient world. Portions of it are now submerged, as are sections of the Roman port at Leptis Magna in modern Libya. The Roman resort town of Baia, on the Bay of Naples, is perhaps the most vivid example of a Roman underwater site. Baiae was the playground of the Roman elite, a place where senators and emperors built lavish villas with heated baths, mosaic floors, and private harbours. Volcanic activity in the Phlegrean fields, the same volcanic system that produced Vesuvius, caused the ground beneath Baiae to subside over the centuries, and much of the town is now 3 to 6 meters below sea level. Today, visitors can explore the ruins by glass-bottom boat, or by diving, swimming through rooms where Roman nobles once reclined on couches and listened to musicians. The parallel to Heracleion is direct. Both cities were built on geologically active ground. Both were gradually claimed by the sea through a combination of subsidence and sea level change. Both were rediscovered using modern technology after centuries of neglect. And both represent only the most visible fraction of the underwater archaeological wealth that remains hidden in their respective regions. But the Mediterranean is not the only ocean that holds drowned cities. Off the coast of the Indian state of Gujarat, in the Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys in 2001 detected what appeared to be the remains of a large settlement on the seafloor at a depth of roughly 30 to 40 meters. The site, if confirmed as artificial, would predate the known cities of the Indus Valley civilization and would represent one of the oldest urban settlements ever discovered. The evidence remains controversial, and not all archaeologists are convinced that the sonar returns represent man-made structures rather than natural geological formations. But the possibility is tantalizing, and it underscores the point that the ocean floor may contain evidence of human activity far older than anything preserved on dry land. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Formation continues to attract divers and researchers despite the ongoing debate about its origins. But Yonaguni is not the only submerged structure in Japanese waters. Off the coast of the island of Karama, divers have reported stone circles and linear features on the seafloor that resemble man-made construction. Near the island of Chatham, other submerged formations have been found that display apparently regular geometry. Whether any of these features are truly artificial remains unproven, but their cumulative effect is to suggest that the coastlines of Japan, like the coastlines of Egypt and Italy, may harbour submerged evidence of human activity that has been lost to the sea. The Black Sea presents yet another frontier. The Black Sea is unusual among the world's oceans in that its deep waters are anoxic, meaning they contain almost no dissolved oxygen. Below a depth of roughly 150 meters, the Black Sea is essentially a dead zone, with hydrogen sulfide replacing oxygen in the water column. This anoxic environment is extraordinarily effective at preserving organic materials. Shipwrecks found in the deep Black Sea are among the best preserved in the world, with wooden hulls, rigging, and even cargo intact after centuries of submersion. If coastal settlements along the Black Sea were inundated by rising waters at the end of the last ice age, as some researchers have proposed, the anoxic deep water may have preserved them in a state of near-perfect conservation, waiting to be discovered. The numbers are striking when you tally them up. Heracleion, Canopus, Manuthis, Pavlopetri, Baia, Caesarea, the Gulf of Kambat site, the Yonaguni Formation, the Black Sea anomalies, and these are only the sites that have been found or credibly reported. For every known submerged site, there are likely dozens, perhaps hundreds, that have not yet been detected. The ocean floor is the largest unexplored archaeological surface on Earth, and it covers 70% of the planet. The technology to explore that surface is improving rapidly. Autonomous underwater vehicles, commonly called AUVs, can now survey the seafloor with centimetre-level resolution over large areas without requiring a human operator. These vehicles can be programmed to follow search patterns, record sonar data, and return to the surface with detailed maps of the bottom. The cost of such technology is falling, and its capabilities are increasing. Within a generation, it may be feasible to conduct comprehensive archaeological surveys of entire coastlines, revealing patterns of submerged settlement that are currently invisible. But technology alone is not enough. The exploration of underwater archaeological sites requires not just equipment but expertise, and the pool of qualified underwater archaeologists is tiny compared to the scale of the task. Training a competent underwater archaeologist takes years. They must be skilled divers, trained conservators, knowledgeable historians, and proficient with the electronic survey equipment that modern underwater work demands. There are perhaps a few hundred such specialists in the entire world. The sites waiting for their attention number in the thousands. This disparity between the scale of the opportunity and the scale of the effort is the central frustration of underwater archaeology. The ocean is full of answers. The resources to retrieve those answers are desperately limited, and every year that passes without exploration is a year in which currents shift sediment, organisms consume organic material, and the archaeological record grows a little fainter. Gaudio understands this urgency better than most. In interviews, he has spoken about the race against time at Heracleion, about the knowledge that every season of excavation may be the last chance to record certain features before they are degraded beyond recognition. His team works with a meticulous thoroughness that reflects this awareness, documenting every artifact in situ before it is moved, creating three-dimensional photographic reconstructions of the site, and publishing their findings in detail, so that the knowledge they extract from the seafloor is preserved, even if the physical remains eventually succumb to the sea. The example of Heracleion has inspired other researchers to take a fresh look at ancient texts that describe coastal cities now lost. The ancient geographer Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, described a city called Helike that was destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami in 373 before the Common Era. Helike was a major Greek city, the capital of the Achaean League, and its destruction was one of the most traumatic events in classical Greek history. Like Heracleion, it was swallowed by the sea. Like Heracleion, it was eventually dismissed by some scholars as a literary invention. And like Heracleion, it was eventually found. In 2001, the same year that Gaudio was raising statues from the floor of Abu Qir Bay, a team led by archaeologist Dora Katsonopoulou announced the discovery of Helike's remains beneath a coastal plain in the northern Peloponnese. The city had not sunk into the sea in the way that Heracleion had. Instead, it had been buried by sediment carried by the river Selinus, which had filled the lagoon that formed over the ruins after the earthquake. The city was there, just as Pausanias described, hidden beneath layers of river mud in a location that no one had thought to dig. The discovery of Helike reinforced the lesson of Heracleion. Ancient texts deserve more respect than modern scholars have sometimes given them. When an ancient author says a city existed at a specific location, and no surface evidence of that city can be found, the default assumption should not be that the author was wrong. The default assumption should be that the evidence is hidden, buried by sediment, submerged by water, or otherwise concealed by the passage of time. The ocean and the earth are very good at hiding things, much better than scholars have historically been at finding them. There is one more angle that deserves exploration in this section, and it concerns the economics of underwater archaeology. Excavating a site like Heracleion is expensive. The boats, the diving equipment, the sonar arrays, the conservation facilities, the salaries of the specialized staff, all of these costs add up quickly. A single season of diving at Heracleion costs hundreds of thousands of euros. Over more than 2 decades of work, the total investment runs into the tens of millions. Where does this money come from? In Gaudio's case, a significant portion of the funding has come from the Hilti Foundation, a charitable organization based in Liechtenstein that has supported underwater archaeological research for decades. Additional funding has come from the Egyptian government, from European cultural institutions, and from the revenue generated by museum exhibitions of the recovered artifacts. The travelling exhibition of Heracleion artifacts has been seen by millions of visitors in cities around the world and has generated substantial income, some of which has been reinvested in the excavation. But this funding model is not easily replicated. Gaudio is a charismatic figure with decades of experience in securing sponsorship for underwater projects. His success at Heracleion has made him one of the most famous underwater archaeologists in the world, which in turn has made it easier for him to attract further funding. Most underwater archaeologists do not have this advantage. They work in relative obscurity, with budgets that are a fraction of what Gaudio commands, on sites that do not produce the kind of spectacular artifacts that draw museum crowds and media attention. The result is a field that is chronically underfunded relative to its potential. Underwater archaeology could, in principle, transform our understanding of human history by revealing the vast record of coastal and maritime activity that the ocean has preserved. In practice, it is a niche discipline that struggles for resources, competes for attention with more established fields, and relies heavily on the dedication of a small number of passionate individuals. The ocean does not care about funding cycles or academic politics. It continues to hide its secrets, indifferent to whether anyone has the budget to find them. There is also the question of sovereignty and jurisdiction. Underwater archaeological sites often lie in areas where national boundaries are disputed, where maritime law is ambiguous, or where the interests of different countries conflict. Heracleion lies in Egyptian territorial waters, and the Egyptian government has been a cooperative partner in its excavation. But other underwater sites are not so fortunate. Wrecks and ruins in international waters are effectively unprotected by law. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provides some framework for the protection of underwater cultural heritage, but enforcement is weak and compliance is inconsistent. Treasure hunters and commercial salvage companies have destroyed numerous underwater archaeological sites by removing artifacts without proper documentation. The temptation is understandable. Ancient gold, silver, and bronze can be sold for enormous sums on the antiquities market. A single artifact from a site like Heracleion could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The difference between archaeology and looting is not the act of removing objects from the seafloor. It is the documentation that accompanies the removal. An artifact recovered with full documentation of its location, orientation, and association with other objects is a piece of evidence. The same artifact ripped from the seabed without documentation is merely an expensive trinket. The knowledge is lost, only the object remains. This tension between commercial and scientific interests has been a recurring theme in underwater exploration since the field's inception. Jacques Cousteau, whose pioneering work in underwater diving and filmmaking in the 1950s and 60s did more than any other individual to bring the ocean's wonders to public attention, struggled throughout his career with the competing demands of science, entertainment, and commerce. His television specials made the underwater world accessible to millions of viewers, but they also created a popular image of underwater exploration as adventure and spectacle rather than as rigorous scientific inquiry. The legacy of that image persists. Underwater archaeology is still sometimes perceived as treasure hunting in fancy equipment, rather than as a legitimate branch of historical research. Gaudio's work at Heracleion has done much to correct that perception. His publications are thorough, his methodology is rigorous, and his findings have been subjected to peer review by scholars in multiple fields. The artifacts he has recovered are not in private collections. They are in museums, accessible to the public and to researchers. He has demonstrated that underwater archaeology can be conducted at the highest academic standards while still producing results that captivate the public imagination. Heracleion is proof that science and spectacle are not mutually exclusive, but for every Gaudio, there are dozens of less scrupulous operators who treat the ocean floor as a commodity rather than a heritage. The challenge for the future of underwater archaeology is not only to find the resources to explore new sites, but to protect the sites that have already been discovered from those who would exploit them for profit. The ruins of Heracleion survived 1,200 years of submersion. Whether they will survive the next 50 years of human activity is a question that has no easy answer. The deeper truth about Heracleion is not about one city. It is about a species that has convinced itself it knows the planet it lives on, while in reality, it has barely scratched the surface. Consider the following statement. More than 95% of the ocean floor has never been directly observed by human eyes or human instruments. This is not an estimate from some dusty textbook. It is the current consensus of the oceanographic community. The number may have improved slightly in recent years, as satellite-derived bathymetry has provided low-resolution maps of the global seafloor. But satellite bathymetry is not the same as direct observation. It gives you the general shape of the terrain, the mountains and the valleys, but it does not show you the details. It does not show you the ruins. It does not show you the artifacts. It does not show you the cities that may be hiding in the sediment. Let that sink in. We live on a planet that is 70% water, and we have directly examined less than 5% of what lies beneath that water. We have better maps of the surface of the moon than we do of our own ocean floor. We have better images of the topography of Mars, taken by orbiting spacecraft, than we do of the bathymetry of most of the Pacific, the Atlantic, or the Indian Ocean. We are, in a very real sense, strangers on our own planet. The number of human beings who have travelled to the deepest point in the ocean, the bottom of the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, is smaller than the number who have walked on the moon. As of the most recent count, fewer than 24 people have made the descent to full ocean depth. 12 people have walked on the moon. The deepest trench in the ocean is more difficult to reach and far less frequently visited than a celestial body roughly 384,000 kilometers away. The depths of our own planet are more alien to us than the surface of another world. This ignorance is not harmless. It has practical consequences. The ocean floor contains mineral deposits of enormous economic value, including manganese nodules, polymetallic sulfides, and rare earth elements that are critical to modern technology. It contains biological resources, organisms with novel biochemistry that could yield new medicines, new materials, and new insights into the fundamental processes of life. It contains the archaeological record of millennia of human maritime activity, a record that is being slowly destroyed by natural processes and, increasingly, by human activity. And it contains the key to understanding processes such as deep ocean circulation, carbon sequestration, and tectonic dynamics that directly affect the climate and geological stability of the surface world. We are making decisions about the future of this planet, decisions about climate policy, about resource extraction, about coastal development, without understanding the vast majority of the planet's surface. That is like making decisions about the management of a house when you have only ever seen 2 of its rooms. The other rooms may contain nothing of interest, or they may contain something critical, something that changes everything you thought you knew about the house. Without looking, you cannot know. And we are not looking. Let that sink in. The case of Heracleion makes this point with uncomfortable precision. Here was a city of enormous historical importance, sitting in one of the most well-travelled bodies of water on Earth, at a depth that a recreational diver could reach without special equipment, and it remained unknown for 1,200 years. 12 centuries during which scholars argued about whether it was real. 12 centuries during which fishermen sailed directly over its ruins. 12 centuries during which the greatest archaeological discovery of the modern Mediterranean waited, patiently, for someone to point a sonar array in its direction. If Heracleion could hide in the shallows of the Mediterranean for that long, what is hiding in the deep Pacific? What is hiding in the abyssal plains of the Atlantic? What is hiding beneath the ice shelves of Antarctica, where the continental shelf may contain archaeological evidence of human activity from periods when sea levels were lower and coastlines extended further than they do today? The standard response to these questions is that the deep ocean is too remote, too expensive, and too hostile to explore comprehensively. And there is truth in that response. Sending a human being to the bottom of the Mariana Trench requires a vessel capable of withstanding more than 1,000 atmospheres of pressure. The cost of such a vessel is measured in tens of millions of dollars. The operational risks are significant, and the deep ocean is vast. Even with unlimited funding, the task of surveying the entire seafloor at archaeological resolution would take decades. But the cost of not exploring is also significant, even if it is harder to measure. Every year that we do not survey the seafloor, we lose information. Currents shift sediment. Organisms consume organic material. Chemical processes dissolve stone and corrode metal. The archaeological record of the ocean floor is not waiting patiently for us to arrive. It is actively disappearing. The question is not whether we can afford to explore the ocean floor. The question is whether we can afford not to. This is not science fiction. This is the reality of life on a water planet. We are a species that has been building cities on coastlines for thousands of years during a period of significant and ongoing sea level change. We know with certainty that many of those cities have been submerged. We know with certainty that most of them have not been found. And we know with certainty that the natural processes that hide and destroy them are operating continuously, around the clock, around the calendar, around the world. The discovery of Heracleion was not just an archaeological triumph. It was a warning. It told us that the ocean is holding secrets on a scale that we have not begun to appreciate. It told us that our understanding of human history is based on an incomplete record, a record that is missing entire chapters because those chapters are underwater. And it told us that the tools to read those chapters exist if we choose to use them. The philosophical implications extend beyond archaeology. The ocean's capacity for concealment forces us to confront a deeper question about the nature of knowledge itself. How confident should we be in any historical narrative when we know that a significant portion of the evidence is inaccessible? How certain can we be about the development of ancient trade networks when the ports that facilitated that trade are sitting on the seafloor, unmapped and unstudied? How much of what we call history is actually a story told from incomplete evidence, a story that would look very different if we could see what the ocean is hiding? The answer is that we should be much less confident than we typically are. The rediscovery of Heracleion did not just add a new chapter to the history of ancient Egypt. It rewrote existing chapters. It showed that Alexandria was not the first great port of the Nile Delta, that centuries of maritime trade preceded its founding, that the relationship between Egypt and the Mediterranean world was older and more complex than the textbook version suggested. Every history book that discussed ancient Egyptian trade routes before the year 2000 was at best incomplete. Many were actively wrong, not because their authors were careless, but because the evidence they needed was sitting on the bottom of the sea. What other histories are wrong for the same reason? What other narratives are incomplete because the evidence is submerged? We do not know, and we cannot know until we look. But the pattern established by Heracleion suggests that the corrections, when they come, will be significant. The underwater record is not a footnote to the terrestrial record. It is a parallel archive of comparable scope and importance, and we have only read the first page. There is a concept in philosophy called the iceberg model of knowledge. The visible portion of an iceberg, the part above the waterline, represents what we know. The submerged portion represents what we do not know. The ratio is typically described as 1 to 9, with 90% of the iceberg hidden beneath the surface. In the case of the ocean's archaeological record, the ratio may be even more extreme. What we have found, Heracleion, Pavlopetri, Baia, the wrecks and ruins that are known and documented, may represent 1% of what is actually there. The other 99% remains underwater, unmapped, unstudied, and unknown. This analogy is not perfect, but it captures something essential about the relationship between the surface world and the world beneath the waves. We live on the tip of the iceberg. We build our civilizations, write our histories, construct our narratives, all on the small fraction of the planet that happens to be above water at this particular moment in geological time. The rest is below us, vast and silent and full of information that we have chosen, through a combination of technological limitation and institutional indifference, not to retrieve. The irony is that the technology to begin retrieving that information already exists. Modern sonar can map the seafloor with resolution sufficient to identify individual structures. Autonomous underwater vehicles can survey large areas efficiently and cost-effectively. Conservation techniques can stabilize and preserve artifacts recovered from saltwater environments. The tools are ready. What is lacking is the collective will to deploy them at the scale the task demands. Some progress is being made. The Seabed 2030 project, a collaborative initiative supported by the Nippon Foundation and the General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans, aims to produce a complete high-resolution map of the entire ocean floor by the year 2030. If successful, this project will provide a baseline map that could be used to identify areas of archaeological potential, guide future explorations, and reveal features of the seafloor that are currently unknown. But mapping is only the first step. Identifying, excavating, and conserving underwater sites requires a level of investment and expertise that goes far beyond bathymetric surveying. The nations of the world spend collectively hundreds of billions of dollars each year on military expenditure. They spend billions more on space exploration. The amount spent on ocean floor exploration is, by comparison, negligible. This disparity reflects a set of priorities that treats the ocean as a resource to be extracted rather than a frontier to be explored. We drill the ocean for oil. We mine it for minerals. We fish it for protein. But we do not study it with the same systematic rigor that we apply to the land, the atmosphere, or outer space. Heracleion is a rebuke to this neglect. It is proof that the ocean floor contains treasures of knowledge that rival anything found on land. It is evidence that our understanding of human history is distorted by the simple fact that we have not looked at most of the planet, and it is a reminder that the window for looking is not infinite. The remains of Heracleion are degrading. The remains of other undiscovered sites are degrading too. Every year of inaction is a year of irreversible loss. The weight of water above those unread pages is immense. Not just the physical weight, measured in atmospheres and kilopascals, but the metaphorical weight of all that concealed knowledge pressing down on our understanding of the world. Every assumption we make about ancient coastal civilizations, every model we build of ancient trade, every timeline we construct of urban development, all of these rest on foundations that are, like the foundations of Heracleion itself, potentially unstable. The ground beneath our knowledge is saturated with unknowns, and the sea level of our ignorance continues to rise. What does the story of Heracleion mean for us? The living, the surface dwellers, the builders of cities that we assume will last. It means, at the very least, that we should hold our assumptions more lightly. The people who built Heracleion were not primitive. They were not ignorant. They were accomplished engineers, skilled architects, devout worshippers, and shrewd merchants. They built their city with the best materials available, on the most strategically important piece of real estate in the ancient Mediterranean, and they fully expected it to endure. It did not. The water came, and the city went, and within a few generations, the memory of it faded so completely that scholars doubted it had ever been there at all. We build our cities with the same confidence. We build on coastlines because coastlines are where trade happens, where economies thrive, where populations concentrate. Half of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of a coastline. Major cities, Mumbai, Shanghai, New York, Lagos, Tokyo, Jakarta, sit at or near sea level, their infrastructure extending into areas that are, by any honest geological assessment, temporary. Sea levels are changing. Coastlines are shifting. Ground is subsiding. The forces that destroyed Heracleion have not retired. They are at work right now, this very moment, beneath the foundations of every coastal city on Earth. This is not a prediction of doom. It is a statement of geological fact. The boundary between land and sea is not fixed. It moves. It has always moved. It will continue to move. The only question is how fast, and whether the cities in its path will have time to adapt. Heracleion did not adapt. Neither did Pavlopetri or Bayer or the dozens of other ancient cities that the sea has claimed. They were built by people who assumed the coastline was stable, and they paid the price of that assumption. The modern world has advantages that the ancient world did not. We can measure subsidence from space. We can model sea level rise with sophisticated computer simulations. We can build seawalls, levees, and flood barriers of a scale and strength that the ancient Egyptians could not have imagined. But we also face challenges that the ancient world did not. Our coastal cities are larger, more complex, and more economically interconnected than anything that existed in antiquity. The disruption caused by the loss of a single modern port city would ripple through the global economy in ways that the loss of Heracleion, devastating as it was locally, never did. There is a philosophical pause required here. Imagine standing on the seafloor of Abu Qir Bay, surrounded by the ruins of Heracleion. The water is murky, the light is dim. A stone column lies on its side, half buried in sand. A statue's face stares up at you from the silt, its expression calm, its eyes empty. You are standing in a place where thousands of people once lived, worked, loved, argued, worshipped, and died. They are all gone. The city is gone. The civilization that built it has transformed beyond recognition, and the sea continues its slow, patient work of erasure, indifferent to the drama of the human story playing out above its surface. What does it mean to build on ground that is not stable? What does it mean to trust in a permanence on a planet where nothing is permanent? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are practical questions with practical implications. Every time a city extends a runway into the sea, every time a developer builds condominiums on reclaimed land, every time a government invests billions in coastal infrastructure, the ghost of Heracleion whispers a warning from the seafloor. The water is patient, the water is strong, and the water does not forget, even when we do. The emotional dimension of this story is worth acknowledging. It is easy to discuss Heracleion in terms of geology and archaeology, of subsidence rates and sonar arrays and conservation protocols. But beneath the science, there is a human story that resonates across the centuries. People built this city. People raised their children in it. People prayed in its temples and mourned their dead in its cemeteries. People fell in love on its streets and grew old in its houses. And all of that is gone, reduced to stone and metal, lying in the mud of a shallow bay, visited occasionally by divers, and studied by a small community of specialists. The gap between what Heracleion was and what it is now is a measure of everything that time and water can do to a human community. And yet, there is something remarkable in the fact that we can still read that story, however faintly. The inscriptions on the stele of Nectanebo are still legible. The face of the happy statue still wears its serene expression. The gold plaques left by ancient worshippers still gleam when the silt is brushed away. The city is gone, but its voice has not been entirely silenced. Through the work of Gaudio and his team, Heracleion is speaking again, after 1,200 years of quiet, telling its story to a world that had forgotten it. There is something sacred in that act of recovery. Not sacred in a religious sense, but in the deeper sense of a debt being honoured. The people who built Heracleion trusted that their work would last. It did not last above the water, but it lasted below it, and now it is being brought back to the light. The promise of permanence was broken by the sea, but the promise of memory is being kept by the people who chose to go looking for what was lost. This is what archaeology does at its best. It reaches into the silence and pulls out a voice. It takes the fragments of a broken world and assembles them into a story that can be told again. It refuses to accept the finality of destruction, insisting that what was lost can be found, what was forgotten can be remembered, what was silence can speak. Heracleion speaks, quietly, through water, through silt, through the careful hands of divers and the patient instruments of science. It speaks of a world that was rich and busy and full of life. It speaks of gods who were worshipped, and taxes that were collected, and ships that came and went. It speaks of a catastrophe that no one recorded, and a silence that lasted longer than the city itself. And it speaks of a discovery that changed what we thought we knew about the past, and what we should expect from the future. The most haunting implication of Heracleion's story is not geological or archaeological. It is existential. We assume that we will be remembered. We assume that the things we build, the institutions we create, the records we keep, will outlast us and carry our story forward to future generations. Heracleion's people assume the same thing. They carved their records in stone. They cast their gods in bronze. They built their temples to last forever. And the sea took all of it, every stone, every statue, every inscription, and held it in the dark for 12 centuries until a man with a sonar machine came along and broke the silence. Will anyone break the silence over our cities 1,000 years from now? Will divers swim through the flooded streets of Mumbai or Miami, brushing silt from the facades of buildings we thought would stand forever? The geological record suggests that this is not only possible, but over a long enough timescale, probable. The sea is rising, the ground is sinking. The same forces that claimed Heracleion are claiming new territory every year. The only variable is time, and the ocean has more of it than we do. Somewhere beneath the Mediterranean, in the soft mud of Abu Qir Bay, a city sleeps. It has been sleeping for more than 1,200 years. The fish that swim through its streets do not know its name. The sediment that buries its temples does not remember the prayers that were once spoken within them. The water that fills its harbour does not recall the ships that once anchored there, the merchants who once haggled on its docks, the priests who once walked its sacred ways with incense and song. Heracleion, Thonis, the city of two names, the gateway to Egypt, the port that every ship had to pass through, the temple where gods received their due, the customs house where fortunes were taxed, the graveyard of 60 ships, the resting place of a 5-meter god carved from red granite, now raised from the dark and standing in museum light, still wearing the same calm expression he wore when the water closed over his face. This is the story of a city that the world forgot, and it is the story of a world that is still forgetting, still building on uncertain ground, still trusting in the permanence of things that are not permanent, still looking upward and outward when the greatest mysteries lie downward, beneath the surface, beneath the waves, beneath the thin skin of certainty that separates what we know from the vast, dark, unknowable deep. The ocean covers more than 70% of this planet. We have explored less than 5% of its floor. Every year the technology to explore it improves, but the funding to deploy that technology lags behind. Every year, the remains of cities like Heracleion degrade a little further, their inscriptions a little fainter, their stones a little more eroded, their story a little harder to read. We are in a race, and we are losing, but we are also winning in small, stubborn increments. Every artifact that Godio's team raises from the seafloor is a victory over forgetting. Every inscription that is photographed and published is a line restored to a text that the ocean tried to erase. Every season of diving at Heracleion is a statement of refusal, a refusal to accept that what the water has claimed is gone forever. The city is not gone, it is transformed. Its stones are still stones, its statues are still statues, its gold is still gold. The water has not destroyed Heracleion, it has preserved it in its own cold, dark, crushing way. The city that was abandoned by its people was adopted by the sea, and the sea has kept it, not carefully, not lovingly, but with the kind of indifferent thoroughness that only geological time can provide. There is a lesson in that preservation. The things we build are more durable than we think. The cities we abandon do not simply cease to exist. They persist, in altered form, waiting to be found. The past is not gone, it is submerged, and the act of diving down to meet it, of descending through the murky water and touching the stones that human hands shaped thousands of years ago, is one of the most profound things a person can do. It is a conversation across time, conducted in silence, in the language of stone and metal and the slow, patient accumulation of sediment. Heracleion waited 1,200 years for that conversation to begin. It will wait longer still for it to be completed. The site is vast, the resources are limited, the ocean is in no hurry. But the conversation has begun, and that is enough. It is enough to know that the city is there. It is enough to know that its story can be read, even if reading it takes generations. It is enough to know that the water, for all its power, could not erase what human hands had built. Tonight, as the Mediterranean rolls over the ruins of Heracleion, the statues stare upward through the darkness. The temple walls hold their positions in the silt. The anchors rest where they fell. The gold plaques bear their inscriptions. The ships lie in their harbour, their keels resting on the same ground that held them when they were alive with crew and cargo and purpose. Nothing moves. Nothing changes. The city is still, but it is not silent. Not anymore. The sonar has spoken, the divers have descended, the artifacts have been raised, the photographs have been taken, the publications have been written, the exhibitions have toured the world. Heracleion has a voice again, thin and wavering after 12 centuries of submersion, but audible, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Listen to it. Listen to the city beneath the waves. Listen to the sound of stone resting on sand, of water moving through empty corridors, of the past whispering to the present across a gulf of darkness and time. Listen, and understand that what we have found is only the beginning, that the ocean holds more than we can imagine, that the floor beneath the waves is a library written in stone and bronze and gold, and we have read barely a single page. The Mediterranean keeps its secrets, but it has given us one, the greatest of them, a city of gods and merchants and ships drowned and forgotten and found again. Heracleion, Thonis, the city that the sea swallowed and the sea preserved, the city that was lost to history and returned to it, dripping with salt water and silence, carrying a message that the surface world has not yet fully understood. The water does not care what you build, but what you build survives longer than you think, and someone, someday, will come looking. They always do.